Hey yo, salute to all my subscribers. Special shout out to everybody else passing through. YouTube, what's good? I came through to let y'all know how important, how very, very important, like vitally important it is with your children to adopt and maintain an open door policy. I was recently had a phone conversation with my mother and having discussions about different things from my childhood and childhood of my 6 other siblings. And the topic of, being an old school parent and having an open door policy came up. And my number one complaint from my childhood, from my upbringing, which, in speaking to some of my siblings, share that same complaint, is that with my parents growing up, there was never an open door policy. There was, and let me explain what I mean by open door policy. There was no, my parents were very old school, particularly my mother had the belief and the theory that the parent is always right no matter what. And even if they're not, so what? You're the child. You listen to the parent no matter what. Don't matter what age you are. You can have no feedback. You cannot say how you feel because I'm not going to value how you feel because it doesn't matter. And that's it. And I'm sorry, but growing up, and we talk about this often, my mother and I bumped heads a lot. Not because I was disrespectful, but because even as a child, even in my adolescence, and especially in my early adulthood, I was very opinionated. I have always been. But opinionated in the interest of having feelings and thoughts, because even as a child, children are very smart. And even as a child, you do have feelings and thoughts and ideas about different things. And even though a child is not going to be right in most situations when it comes to, that child-parent relationship, you still should offer the opportunity for your child to speak their thoughts, to tell you how they're feeling about a situation or in a situation. And when I say open door policy, I mean, we could never speak our mind. And when I say speak our mind, I don't mean, again, being disrespectful, saying things that are out of the way. I just mean, if you told me about something and you expected me to follow that or be that, or if I didn't live up to your expectations as a child, you let me hear about it. I felt like as a child, as a young, teenager in my adolescence, and then as a young adult, that I should be able to not necessarily challenge it, but I should be able to speak my piece about it. And, with my mother and a lot of old school parents, that was, to say the least, frowned on. I mean, you were considered to be disrespectful if you said anything that was against, what your parents thought, said, or had in mind for you or had planned for you. I mean, and in my case, my upbringing, some things were very extreme. But in this generation and age of what I call new age parents, there is an extreme on the other end of the spectrum of parents trying to be their kids' friends. And I'll touch on that in another blog, but there's a happy medium, right? My approach for my children, I believe that there's different stages. I have an 8-year-old and a 9-year-old, right? And a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old. And at the ages that they are, they're just coming out of the stage of me being a dictator, and it's what I say goes, because in those earlier years, they're not of that mental capacity to really have much in the way of input. And it really is all about protecting them, and everything that they do, the consequences don't fall on them, they fall on you. But now they are starting to get into that second stage where it becomes, it's still a little bit of a dictatorship where it's what I say goes, but at the same time, they are encouraged and they are able to voice their opinions about different things. And now my 12, soon to be 13-year-old will have even more of an ability to do that, because with more responsibility that you give your children, by that same token, you also have to give them more of the privileges of coming into that adolescence and early adulthood. Because the more you try to stifle that, see, people talk about stifling the imagination of children too young, the creativity of children too young. And people talk about how resilient and how smart children can be. But then at the same time, a lot of these old school parents, it was almost like a contradiction, because if you're not willing to nurture that, even in situations where it may be uncomfortable for you, you're stifling your child. And, me having that uncomfortable conversation with my mother at 35, telling her, listen, because you didn't have that open door policy with me, I can't speak for my other siblings. I know that they feel the same way, but I don't know the extent to where that goes. But from me at 35, speaking to my mother, saying, listen, you didn't have an open door policy with me. I didn't feel like I could speak my mind with you. I didn't feel like I could have an opinion. I didn't feel like I could offer feedback into certain things. And, I feel like that caused some issues for me, in my life at that time, and then into my early adulthood and certain relationships. Because let's be real, the most important, I talk about it all the time on this platform, and even my mother agreed with this, the most important, the number one, there are, in my opinion, three things, but the most important thing to a successful adult relationship is communication. But the problem with communication is that it needs to be, bilateral. It's a two-way thing. But in most of the adult relationships, you usually find where there's a breakdown in communication is because most often it's a one-way stream, and that's not okay. But the reason why it's that way is because our old school parents, for those of you who are in my age group, who came up in my generation, a lot of us, too many of us, most of us, didn't have that ability to communicate back. So you didn't learn that, right? Communication is a skill, and the inner workings and the different, cavernous trails and paths through the caves of relationships, right? It takes practice and time, and it's a skill set that you develop on how to move through. A lot of us didn't start learning that until our adulthood, when we got away from those types of parents. And no wonder why a lot of our first relationships fell apart. No wonder why a lot of our first relationships weren't fruitful and, ended with us being bitter and jaded about relationships and love and marriage, because the skill set that's required for communication to work properly, we should have been learning that from the time we were young. And because of so many old school parents, that wasn't promoted, that wasn't allowed, it wasn't tolerated. And, at 35, even trying to explain that to my mother, she still didn't understand that, because it's just, she's just so set in her ways when it comes to that even at 35, a lot of those old school parents still see their sons and daughters as their children. And it's like, at some point, you have to learn to respect your kids as adults. And if you can't do it when they're a child, you at least need to be able to acknowledge that when they're adults. And the purpose of this isn't to bash my parents. It's just to understand that for those of you who are new age parents, and I know that typically our first inclination is two ways that we will typically raise our kids by default. Either exactly the way that we were raised, or the exact opposite, because we totally rebel from how our parents raised us. And both are wrong. You have to find a balance somewhere in the middle, and you have to do what works for you. You have to try and exclude or enhance the things that they did that you felt were not right, while at the same time instilling the same values that were instilled in us. Because the majority of us did grow up, pretty decent for the most part, the majority of us, not all of us. But what I would say to my new age parents, right? Parents raising young kids, because you got to start young. Please adopt an open door policy, right? You have to set the rules for your children. You have to instill morals. You have to instill a sense of self. You have to instill the understanding of responsibility and accountability, but also understand that your children are going to want to do things outside of the realm of what you feel is right. And sometimes they're going to want to do things that you may feel are maybe detrimental to their health or detrimental to their mental and emotional development. And yes, you are still going to push that they abide by those things because you do know with the age that you have and experience that you have that it is in their best interest. But it's all about the delivery, and it's all about letting them be a part of that process and that discussion and that decision. Because if you don't, let's be honest, the majority of kids will rebel just because they feel like they don't have a voice. Please give your children a voice. I don't know everything there is to know about parenting. No one does. There is no guide. Well, there's no perfect guide to parenting. It's just a lot of people with a lot of theories and ideas. And you are never going to know the full expanse of exactly how well or how poorly you raised your children until they become adults, and they're the best or worst reflection of that. And then they will give you that feedback as adults. But trust me, you cannot go wrong with adopting and maintaining an open door policy, because this is what's going to happen. If you don't have an open door policy with your children and you just lay down the law because that's what it is and you're the parent, when they fall short, because they will, all kids do, when they fall short of those things, they're not going to be inclined to come to you for advice on how to fix those things. And two, they're going to be less equipped to not make those mistakes because they don't feel like they have that guidance, that mentor to go to. And that's when they start to seek out information. That's when they start to seek out advice from their peers. And kids giving advice to other kids is like the blind leading the blind. And you don't want that to be their sole source of support. So you have to adopt and maintain an open door policy, because what's going to happen is, even in those tough situations, even in those situations where they may feel uncomfortable or embarrassed to bring it to you, at least they'll know that they can bring it to you without judgment, that they can bring it to you and be talked about and treated, at least a little bit like an adult as it pertains to the situation that they're dealing with. And you know that they're going to come to you no matter what. So in those situations, you can give the best advice. Please don't be closed-minded when it comes to this parenting issue, because too many parents make this mistake. No, you don't want to try and be your kid's friend and let them just run rampant, but you don't want to keep them in a cage. You don't want to try and wall them off from the world, because it's going to be a shell shock when those kids get out into the world finally and see that the shit's a jungle. And they're going to look back and in one way, shape, or form blame you for not properly preparing them for the life that's out there waiting for them. And it starts as soon as they get into adolescence and even before that, because you have to lay that groundwork. You have to be willing to, in a controlled environment, allow your kids to be exposed to things and discuss those things with them and get their feedback of what they think about those situations, how they think they should respond, what the things that they think they may want to do, and what the potential consequences for those things they think they want to do could be, so that you know they understand, and so that they know that you understand, that they have an opinion. And that just nurtures the best, in my opinion, relationship in the best possible environment for your children to grow up in. Listen, man, I don't pretend to know everything. This is just some shit that I picked up along the way. I'm definitely putting it into practice. If it doesn't work, and I'll find out that 15, 20 years from now, then it doesn't work. But I know that the way that it was done to me did not. So I have to find a new way and see if that works. And that's what parenting is. That's what relationships are about. That's what life is about. It's a series of trials and different, different techniques and approaches to see what works best. Because more things will not work than what will work. But the only way to find what will work is to get through all of the shit that don't work. So I'm not going to continue to repeat the same shit that I had to go through thinking as a 12-year-old, 14-year-old, 15-year-old, thinking, well, I can never go to my parents. I'm never going to go to them. So when you ask me at 35 why I never went to you, well, it's because I felt like I couldn't. I felt like whatever I had to say wouldn't be valued or believed or nurtured the right way. I don't pretend to know everything. Just know what I know. Let me know what y'all think about this one, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace and love.